You enjoyed your coffee and are ready for another interesting and energizing session. I'm sorry, I should have started with Excellencies, distinguished experts, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols being observed. We're going to be looking at some very interesting challenges with respect to the mobilization of public-private partnerships and the financial architecture involved. We're going to begin by introducing ourselves, then I'm going to make a brief technical perspective. The EU asked me to do that. Then we're going to allocate questions to our distinguished panelists. These questions dig into their specific experience and have been articulated in collaboration with the African Development Bank. And then we're going to move on to some open questions of a more strategic nature at the policy and enabling environment levels. Then if there's time, we're going to open the questions to the floor, and we're going to end by inviting our panelists to give us a 1-minute takeaway of what they see as their biggest challenge and how they would fix it if they had a free hand. So beginning with introductions, let me introduce myself before the panel. I'm an international researcher advisor on water policy and sector investment strategy. I left graduate school in 1975, and since then my work has taken me to 45 countries on 4 continents. I'm currently the team leader of the EU Water Stars project, but in addition to that type of work, I'm also a partner director of a small water sector investment incubator called the Indo-African Agricultural Capital Company. We are working with the Islamic Development Bank in Sierra Leone at the commercial financing of farmer-led irrigated value chains. We're developing a regional financing, 10-year financing plan for the government of Zambia. And in Kenya, in collaboration with the Tana River County and the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development, we are developing a large investment proposal for a nucleus estate and outgrower program of about 15,000 hectares. So it's fair to say that I have my feet in both camps, the development sector and the commercial sector. So next, please. Sir, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah. I'm Atar Hannoura, the director of the PP Central Unit. I was working for the Central Unit, PP Central Unit in the Ministry of Finance since 2007. Before that, I was working for the World Bank for around 9 years. And before that, I was in the private sector.
Ahmed Farouk, the Regional Commercial Manager for Tito company in charge of Africa. I've been in the water sector for about 20 years, dealing with different projects in Africa and other regions. Thank you.
Hassan Far, Chairman of CAPO, Construction Authority for Potable Water and Wastewater.
عبد الوهاب حلمي مدير عام الجبل الأصفر مشروع الجبل الأصفر إن شاء الله أنا أستوضحه خلال البرزنتيشن.
Mohammed Youssef. I am the board member of the Arab Contractors, and my experience is in project management in projects, and for a brief time I joined the government for 2 years, but now I'm working as a board member in the Arab Contractors company.
Thank you very much indeed. Just by way of background, I was at the 12th annual meeting of the Infrastructure Consortium for Africa at the AFDB's headquarters in Abidjan. And we learned a little bit there about the financing gap. The financing gap has already been mentioned in the earlier session this morning. But we learned that investments in water in Africa are running at only 25% of investments in ICT and only 25% of investments in energy. And of the investments that are being made, only 7% can be thought of as multi-purpose. Now, the development partners in the room that day said, oh dear, yes, water is really crucial, but it's so difficult. Yet the pressures have not decreased. We still have climate change, we have population growth, we have economic diversification, and we have urbanization, all of which put increasing demands on our water resources. So the problems are worsening, but there is still the financing gap. Now, we're a little bit concerned today about where the private sector might fit in. So it is also interesting to know that at the 2016 Budapest Water Summit, which had the title Water Connects, we've heard about Water Connects already this morning, a vice president of the European Investment Bank said that, listen to this, said that he knew of $20 trillion of private sector money, $20 trillion of private sector money that would be available for investment somewhere in the global water sector if only the pricing signals were understood. This is bad news for a water manager because the private sector usually increases supply of goods or services when the pricing signals go up, but the water manager wants water to be allocated, does not want water supply to be increased just because prices increase. So there's a potential conflict between the objectives of the private sector and the requirements of the public sector. And that's only one of the problems that we have. We also have a problem of different appraisal metrics. When the public sector appraise investment projects let's say, in the water sector, their metrics are often environmental and social, whereas the private sector, their metrics are always financial. In fact, I was asked, along with my distinguished colleague Salah Dargouth, who I'm sure some of you know, to review a World Bank proposal for a $130 million PPP in irrigation service in Ghana. The first sentence of the executive summary said, this project has failed because the water users have not paid their service charge, but we think the private sector can fix that. Well, if I was looking for a deal for a private sector company, I would have closed the prospectus at that stage. But I did finish reading it and found that it was predicated entirely on very good, very important metrics like socio-economic transformation, better use of natural resources, etc., but nothing, not a single metric in that entire perspective would mean anything to the private sector. The private sector wants to know about revenues, it wants to know about capital growth, it wants to know about something called an EBITDA multiplier, it wants to know how capital has to be deployed. There was nothing in this entire prospectus that would mean anything to the private sector. So surprisingly, later that year, or a couple of years later, I was in Washington at the World Bank on a high-level panel discussing this very issue and was actually asked by the International Finance Corporation, what is the private sector actually looking for? Well, I said it's looking for money. It's looking for profit, because most companies in this world, by law, are required to prioritize wealth generation for their shareholders. There's no escape from that. We also have the problem of water rights. If I'm going in as a PPP provider of water service delivery, I would want to know how secure my water use permit was going to be. I'd want to know if I had a permit, and I'd want to know what relationship I have with the people that I'm supplying the water to. Do they also have a water use permit? They have the human right to water, but what else are there? And the private sector sees the water sector in many, particularly in the emerging markets, as high risk. So I would also perhaps be looking for revenue guarantees, and we call that now a form of blended capital. So despite these challenges, despite the difficulties the donors see, despite the difficulties reconciling the interests of the public and the private sector, the cash is still there. We learned this morning about vast amounts of cash. And I just mentioned 20 trillion of private money. The opportunities are still there. In construction, we heard a little bit about BOT and things like that this morning. We have service provision, the various ways to do that. Affirmage is an interesting one. But another form of PPP, which has not been considered here to the best of my knowledge, but is very successful in Bangladesh, is you can actually set up a PPP for water service charge collection. And that has been very successful in Bangladesh, both in the water supply and sanitation sector, but even more so in the irrigation sector, where a more robust water service charge has resulted in a major crop diversification breakthrough away from wetland rice to high-value horticulture. And as we heard earlier this morning, the range of options is growing. But can I also say that the scale continues to diversify? We tend to think big, but the literature says that in Africa, where we're considering this morning, that Africa has great success in very small scale PPPs, which is an interesting thing. So This session is intending to explore these themes, first, as I said, with specific personal insights from our distinguished panelists, and secondly, more at the policy level. So with that introductory note, could I invite Engineer Attar Hanura to answer the following question. What challenges prevent previous valuable projects from realization under PPP modalities, and what could be done to unlock water and wastewater projects?
This is a, yeah. Actually, to answer this question, we need a lot of time to answer it. However, I'll try to summarize it. PPPs, by nature, takes some time in procurement. And to make this procurement less in time and more rapid, you have to prepare the project and prepare the documents starting from the planning phase through the project cycle itself. So if this project preparation, starting from planning, and planning here, planning the location of the land, because as I mentioned before, earlier this week, in this event, desalination and sometimes as well the wastewater treatment plants are very much let me say, land specific, especially in desalination. If you select the location of a desalination project, the cost of the desalinated water, the cubic meter per day, okay, would be very high because of the intake, the cost of the intake, and how far this location from the network that you want to pump this water in. All these kind of factors are very crucial and important. So selecting the location of the site of the station, wastewater or desalination in specific, is very crucial in the costing. And sometimes the bad selection of the land might turn the project to be infeasible, not viable. So we have to take care of this. And unfortunately, especially in desalination, we decide to put a desalination project, a desalination station in a place that already congested by population. And once it's congested by population, this means that all the seafront lands are already taken, and it's make it very difficult for the authorities to start taking a piece of land for this desalination project. The second point in this regards is who is the tendering authority and what is the structure of the tendering authority. I'm talking about the PPPs in particular and how to attract the private sector to invest in the water and wastewater and desalination projects in particular. Thank God that there is a very huge interest in the private sectors and in the banks to get involved and to participate in such projects. It's well known, stable, the documents are international standards, and we're following the international standards. Technologies are stable, and there is a lot of operators, I repeat, operators, which is the main important partner in the SPV, the main partner in the consortium that will take care of this or implement this station, the operator. The PPs are much different than the conventional construction of a station, because the operation is the main crucial issue. It's 20 years, 25 years, 30 years project, and the operator is operating for this period of time, and the construction is only, and designing is only 2 years or 2.5 years. So the operator who will know in the first place how to put his bid, how to calculate his bid, how to calculate, to create a financial model to bid properly. Okay? One of the things that preventing or making it a little bit difficult to have a lot of PPPs in the water area apart from the land issues, is the infrastructure around this piece of land. Hypothetically, I have a piece of land to have a wastewater treatment plant. The government or the authorities have to connect the pipes to the borders of this site. The influent piping and the effluent piping as well. So this should be there, up and running, ready by the time of operation. Or actually 6 months prior the date of operation, because the service provider have to do all his testing, and this he will use this testing, this piping and this testing, okay, and commission. So the networks, all the infrastructure in terms of utilities and piping and networking, this should be available. Actually, I'm saying this because 3 projects were studied and ready to be tendered. However, the infrastructure and piping rerouting to go to this station was not done by the time of bidding, and actually this bid was cancelled. 6th of October, wastewater treatment plant, 4 or 5 years ago, or actually 7 years ago, 8 years ago, actually in 2012, was cancelled after studying, because there should be a unit separating the industrial waste from the domestic waste, because this was a domestic station. This apparatus, this unit was not done. Accordingly, we could not tender it out because the supply of the effluent was not there. So all these things prevent tendering PPs, wastewater treatment plants or desalination treatment plants to under the PPs. Given that the PPP procurement and document preparation and contracts take some time, and the most important, the private sector we have to give them their time to calculate and to prepare their bid. And if we tell them you have got only 2 months or something to put your bid, they actually say, sorry, we will not bid. We're not bidding. And actually, we practiced this issue before. You have to give them their time. They have to do their exact calculation. They need to sharpen their pen and do the fine calculation because they are bidding and they don't want to lose the bid. So we have to give them the time.
I think I'm going to have to call time.
Yes. Given that, well, the final thing is that, given this, having said so, the issue is that we don't take, the authorities does not take all these precautions or these procedures to bid, and accordingly, the need is getting higher. The request for this project or for this wastewater treatment plant or for this desalination project is coming urgent and crucial, so the only thing to do is go to the direct conventional procurement under EPC or EPC plus financing, because we don't have enough time to do the proper PPP transaction, and accordingly, most of the projects are going to EPC plus financing, and this is overloading the budget of the government. Thank God that the desalination project now have got a very clear, ambitious plan for 30 years, broken into 5 years plan, and we're working on it now. They are finalizing the issues of the land, and all these lessons learned, hopefully, are taken in consideration in this plan, and accordingly, we're already having 4 projects to be tendered, and 1 or 2 projects under wastewater in the pipeline to be tendered next year, year to 2022, and hopefully all these lessons learned are taken in consideration. Thank you, and sorry for being long.
Thank you, Engineer Atta. Next up is, yes, thank you so much. Next up is Mr. Ahmed Farouk of Metito. And your question is, in your opinion, what is an appealing PPP concept in the water sector? What are the key shaping factors? In addition, what is your understanding of the difference between PPP and other types of finance, such as affirmage and outsourced service delivery?
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm the only one here representing the private sector in this panel. I actually wished my question would be after the speeches of my colleagues from the public sector, so to answer all the
we can reorder. Would that be better?
I mean, it's just an opinion. If you
no,
depends on you. Of course, you are the boss.
Please, you just continue. Let them answer your problems.
Okay. So, of course, as Mr. Atter said, there are many issues about Triple P that has to be clear to all the parties of the project. So, as understood from the name, public-private partnership. So it's a partnership. Sometimes you call it a marriage between the public sector, the government, and the private sector. The feasible PPP project may last for 25, 30 years. This is the normal duration of the concession project. So it's sometimes longer than a marriage. A marriage may not last for 30 years. So 30 years of a commitment from all parties that has to be well structured to assure the sustainability of the project and the success of the project. Otherwise, we will have many milestones along this period where the project can fail. And I've seen projects in the market for more than 15 years, as you mentioned, for example, in Ghana and other projects, maybe not in the water sector, maybe in the transportation sector or the road sector, they have been here for more than 15 years, going back and forth and saying, is it feasible, is it not feasible, and going to the parliament and then going back to the government, and the project has been going back and forth for decades and it's not progressing yet. So, as Dr. Phil mentioned, the first priority for the private sector is to maximize the wealth of its shareholders. This is the duty of the private sector and the shareholding companies. And maximizing the wealth means can be translated into what we call IRR, internal rate of return. This is the requirement of the lenders, of the private sector, of the companies, of the shareholders. So we have been in the market for more than 60 years now. We are in the Triple P business for more than 30 years now. We have done Triple P projects in many continents and countries all over the world with different cultures. We have done in Dubai. It's a very luxury community. And we have done in Rwanda, in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, completely different community. And in Serbia, we are doing a project now, in Saudi Arabia, in China before. We had concessions in China, big, huge concessions. So what makes a Triple P project good, appealing, and successful, what we call it, bankability of the project. If the project is bankable, meaning that I can go to the banks and say to them, I have this project, and the banks will say, this project is bankable, we can finance this project. What are the requirements of the banks? What does the banks want from us? So the public sector wants the service, want to be provided to the citizens, to the community. But for us to be able to provide this, we have to go to the lenders and get the money from the lenders. So for us, we need to fulfill the requirements of the lenders. We are just a middleman between the lenders and the public sector. We don't have the money ourselves. We just go to the banks and ask them for the money. We go to the European Bank, African Development Bank, World Bank, JICA, JBIC. We go to the banks and we get the money and we do the project. We get the finance for the project. It's not like EPC plus finance, and this is part of the question, what are the differences between the types of financing? So Triple P is not like EPC plus finance. Triple P, the money is supplied to the private sector. The private sector invests the money and charges the what we call the off-taker, which is the government in this case, who are the off-taker for the project, and they pay only the tariff. They have to pay only a tariff per cubic meter against the service. So we take this tariff, and we have to pay for our capex, we have to pay for our opex, we have to make a profit, we have to pay back the lenders their investment. So in order to make this bankable, we have to make sure that this will be achievable. So the first thing that the lenders require is the IRR. They have a requirement. We cannot go to them and say our IRR is only 10%. They will not accept. they will ask for 17, 20% IRR. We have to submit a financial model showing them that this project is achieving an IRR of a certain percentage. Otherwise, they will not accept the project. The banks need to see commitment from the government or the public sector in the form of, first, what we call concession agreement or offtake agreement. There has to be a concession agreement. We see some tenders, there is no concession agreement in the tender document. There is no offtake agreement. There is no commitment. There is no guarantees. So if this is the tender, and we have to go to the banks before bidding for the tender and tell them we have a project, there is a tender. So we have to show to the public sector that we are able to get the finance, and we have to show the finance structure that we are going to use for the project. And we cannot just simply go to the banks and ask them to give the commitment to finance the project without having a draft concession agreement or a draft offtake agreement. In some countries, I'm talking globally, not specific for Egypt. In some countries, the off-taker is also a private sector, and the government is playing only the role of coordination between the private sector and, again, for example, when we treat wastewater from municipalities and supply the treated effluent to the industry, to the private industries. So in this case, it's very difficult to structure an off-take agreement between the industry going through the public sector and back to the private sector. So the concession agreement has to be there. The off-taker, the off-takers has to be very clear. Who will buy the service? So I'm producing water. Who will buy the water? I have to get a commitment from someone that he is committed to buy this water. Otherwise, I will invest and nobody will buy the water. The PPP in the water sector is much more complicated than PPP in the power sector, IPP, what we call it, independent power producer, because the power is much easier. People need the power. They cannot live without electricity, and they have to pay for it. But for water, you cannot just cut the water from the people. The government cannot do this, but maybe you can cut the power, but water you cannot cut. So how can the government afford to pay the tariff? And then we come again to the issue of the tariff structure. As Dr. Said says in the previous session, that the tariff in Egypt, for example, 10 years ago was about 2 cents per cubic meter, which is a very, very low tariff. So now the tariff for PPP may be much higher than this. So who will subsidize or who will finance this gap? The government has to subsidize. So the government needs to restructure the tariff and to have a plan to increase the tariff gradually until it can reach near to the actual cost. So the governments in different countries has to understand this. So we have completed our first concession, a PPP project in Kigali in Rwanda. This is now in operation for about 6 months, and its capacity is 40,000 cubic meters per day. It's small capacity, but for Rwanda it's a big one because it's almost supplying half of the population of the capital of Rwanda, of Kigali. It's about 2 million people. Yeah. So for them it's a significant project, and it was not easy to make this project happen. So there is what we call after tendering and contract award and all this these steps. We have what we call financial close. So financial close means, okay, we have tendered, we are successful, we got the project awarded. Now we come to the reality. The reality is how to fulfill the requirements of the lenders. So the lenders have a list of requirements that has to be fulfilled until we reach what we call financial close. All these requirements has to be fulfilled by the government and the private sector. It took us about 2 years to reach financial close because the government in Rwanda, they did not, they missed a lot of details in the PPP process. So as Mr. Atter said, if the project has to be well prepared, and the governments need to understand exactly what it takes to have a PPP project and to make a PPP project successful and work and fulfill the requirements of the lenders. So this is in brief.
Yeah, thank you so much. We're already developing a complementarity here. We have preparation, we have this vicious circle between market and finance. It works the same with people that are promoting added value. Well, nobody invests in added value if the supply is not there. The suppliers won't change their farming systems unless the market is there. It's a common problem, whichever way we look at it in the water sector. Let's stay with the private sector and move on to our representative, Dr. Mohammed Yusuf from the Arab contractors. We'd like you to tell us the story behind the financing of two national mega infrastructure projects, the El Masama Drain and El Bakar Drain. We'd like to look at that from the strategic perspective, but coming back to the previous presenter, how did Arab contractors manage to raise the funds? And what was the role of the public sector in the raising of those funds?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Let me just start by a bit of a background, which is not takes that much time. Of course, we, as the Arab contractors, we have been involved in wastewater treatment plants and water treatment plants for so many years now, maybe more than 40 years. Bahr al-Baqar, as you mentioned, and you mentioned al-Mahsama, I think. Al-Mahsama, we're not part of that, but Bahr al-Baqar, I can tell you about it. The fact that we were, the government is financing Bahr al-Baqar, but maybe we put some effort to the arrangement of the financing. But it is provided for the government. What I would like to say is that the issue here, I mean, if we look at it from an abstract perspective, is that the problem is that when the investor comes and try to join this PPP project, and he says that by the end of the day, the price per meter cube is so and so, and the government say, no, 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 this is very high. Part of that is really allocated to the fact of risk. So we can look at two dimensions here. If the government can take some of the risks that would an investor take into consideration and put some allocation for it in his budget, if the government can take this, and in some instances this is possible, then the investor can reduce his the cost and becomes a bit feasible to the government. The next issue here is that in PPP we can look as well, because it's a wide definition, and in some of the instances, according to my understanding, is PPP would cover things that that is ordinarily done by the government or by the public sector, but is being allocated to the private sector. So we had a wide perspective here. So the second dimension, besides the risks that the government can do, or governments, not only the Egyptian government, beside having the risk allocated, is to not look at the, we can look halfway. For example, maybe there is some rehabilitation of existing facilities, maybe changing some of the processes for the existing facilities. This can reduce the capital expenditure of the private sector, hence becoming less riskier for them, and it would lubricate the wheel to run faster. This can be done especially in Egypt because we have many wastewater treatment projects in Egypt. So what I'm trying to say here is that EPC plus F is one of the issues that we have been engaged with, and I think that the success stories in EPC plus F, and I'm not here speaking about the only wastewater treatment projects, but other projects in other sectors, is to work jointly with the government. If you work jointly with the government from the inception phase, and the parties are included, this even if it was tendered afterwards, and this happened, that you work for 2 years and then the government decides it should be tendered. But even that, and even though the costs that would be borne by the parties, the investors, but this would help everybody to reach a common goal and you know, like an agile perspective, not a perspective of having a tender and you have to abide by this, and then you discover that this cannot be done, and the government is in a problem because they have either to reissue the tender and all of these regulations. So, in order to summarize, only two issues is try to share the risk, and then we may have a good perspective to the cost which is, by the end of the day, is what everybody is looking for. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you homed in on the question. Yes, sorry. I'm very happy that you homed in on the question of risk allocation, because this is the missing link in a partnership. In a partnership, both partners share the risk. If I have no risk, it's an outsourcing contract. We're going to return to that in the open questions if there's time. Thank you. So moving on, is our colleague from Morocco around? Mr. Mbarak Kader. Oh, great. Good morning, Mr. Mbarak Kader. Sorry to address you in English. I did send you a French version of the question. What are the guiding factors behind the Moroccan experience in private sector involvement and evolution through the years? And what might a long-term look reveal with respect to modalities for supporting public-private partnerships? Sir, over to you.
Merci. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Donc, because for my little English, so I try to do this presentation to share with my colleague our experience in Morocco about the externalisation de la gestion des installations d'eau potable en milieu rural au secteur privé. I think there is a presentation on your screen. Is it clear?
There's no presentation.
Okay.
ICT, there should be a presentation on the screen.
I share it, but I don't know.
I haven't received a presentation.
Okay. So,
okay. It's coming, sir. It's on its way. Il arrive tout de suite.
il arrive tout de suite.
Voilà.
OK. Cette présentation s'articule principalement sur, tout d'abord, un bref view sur l'ONE, sur la stratégie de l'Office national de l'électricité et l'eau potable, et surtout, on va s'attarder un petit peu sur la gestion des installations de l'alimentation en eau potable dans le rural à travers l'externalisation de cette gestion, que ce soit technique ou commerciale, au secteur privé. After, please. Rappelons que depuis bien avant 2001, l'Office a intervenu pour alimenter les populations rurales dans les différents coins du royaume. Et à partir de 2001, une décision a été forte par les autorités gouvernementales pour mandater l'ONE, notre office, pour devenir l'acteur principal de référence dans la distribution dans les zones rurales. Pour cela, beaucoup d'investissements ont été mobilisés à travers le partenariat avec les différents bailleurs de fonds, toutes sortes confondues, asiatiques, américaines et européennes et africaines aussi, qui ont voulu contribuer à l'effort de l'Office. Et à valeur d'aujourd'hui, on est pratiquement sur un taux d'accès dans les zones rurales, je précise dans les zones rurales, qui est pratiquement de 97,8%, alors que ce taux était de moins de 50% en 2000. Actuellement, 13 millions d'habitants à travers le royaume bénéficient de cet accès à l'eau potable dans les zones rurales pour un investissement global depuis 2000 à ce jour-là de 2,2 milliards de dollars. After, please. Pour cela, bien sûr, il faut développer. Tout l'effort de développement, de mobilisation d'investissement a été fait pour desservir cette population, mais il y a quand même, juste tous ces efforts-là, on était contraint à un certain nombre de risques. D'une part, c'est le fait que la distribution dans les zones rurales connaisse un problème de rentabilité économique et sociale si on la compare par rapport aux métropoles urbaines. Et ceci pourra impacter la viabilité et la santé financière de notre département ministériel. Et aussi, on était contraint de la réduction des moyens qui sont offerts par les pouvoirs publics en termes de moyens surtout humains et matériels. Devant ça, et vu on est obligé, en plus de réaliser les investissements, de pérenniser ces installations parce que et aussi essayer d'optimiser davantage l'exploitation. Après, s'il vous plaît. Les différents modes de gestion qui ont été adoptés depuis à ce jour-là, en plus de la gestion à travers communautaire par le biais des associations d'usagers qui au niveau local, et on a opté pour 3 autres formules, principalement qui touchent le secteur privé. D'une part, la gestion des bornes fontaines à travers des personnes physiques, donc des gardiens gérants qui gèrent les points d'eau publics. Et puis, on a étendu un petit peu ce spectre-là pour donner la gestion et sous-traiter la gestion à des micro-entreprises. Ce sont des petites entreprises. Et l'Office a contribué depuis à ce jour-là à la création de 860 micro-entreprises qui gèrent que de l'eau potable dans les zones rurales. Et on est sur des formules un peu maintenant étendues, vu on est sur un territoire vaste et des installations structurantes. On est sur des gestions, une externalisation de la gestion étendue à des petites et moyennes entreprises. Après, s'il vous plaît. Pour cela, donc, on voulait un peu partager avec l'assistance cette gestion étendue qui vise à étendre la responsabilité de l'opérateur de ces petites et moyennes entreprises et renforcer son autonomie. Mais, en contrepartie, l'Office reste toujours l'interface, reste toujours là, le responsable de service de l'eau vis-à-vis des clients. La sous-traitance se fait à travers, on a adopté 2 formules. Une formule qui concerne une externalisation de la gestion à travers des contrats de 5 ans sans transfert de risque. Et une autre formule avec un transfert de risque sur 10 ans. Après, s'il vous plaît. Donc, pour le premier cas de première formule, sans transfert de risque, c'est-à-dire que l'opérateur privé vient pour gérer les installations de l'Office selon les standards de l'Office. Actuellement, on a à peu près une trentaine de contrats avec à peu près trentaine d'entreprises nationales et internationales. Et ces marchés englobent à peu près 7000, un peu plus de 7000 localités sur une superficie de plus de 44 000 kilomètres carrés à gérer. Et le montant de ces marchés sont aux alentours de 12 millions de dollars. Et l'expérience à ce jour-là montre qu'on a réduit les charges de l'Office à travers cette formule-là, sans transfert de risque. Les charges de l'Office ont été réduites d'environ à peu près 12 millions de dollars. Après, s'il vous plaît. Pour l'autre formule, après, qui met le risque sur l'opérateur privé. Donc, on est toujours, l'Office et les responsables vis-à-vis des collectivités locales et des clients et de la population. C'est lui qui est responsable de service. Et lui, selon ses prérogatives et les bases juridiques de la création de l'office, il donne la possibilité à cet opérateur de gérer à sa place. Les conditions de ce contrat, donc 10 ans.
Excusez-moi, vous avez juste 1 minute encore, monsieur.
OK, après, s'il vous plaît. S'il vous plaît, après. Donc, cette sous-traitance, elle est basée sur l'OBA, Output Based Aid. Et ces subventions-là permettent d'équilibrer, surtout dans les premières années, aux opérateurs privés, d'équilibrer leur balance financière pour pouvoir un peu surmonter le déficit dans les premières années. Une fois dépassé les 3-4 années de gestion, ça leur permet un peu d'équilibrer leur équilibre et bénéficier d'un chiffre d'affaires au-delà qui est intéressant. Après, s'il vous plaît. Après, s'il vous plaît. Après, s'il vous plaît.
Next slide.
Next slide. Next slide, please. Actuellement, on a trois opérations en cours avec la contribution. Je profite de l'occasion de remercier la Banque africaine de développement et l'Agence française de développement qui ont voulu contribuer à l'Office en mettant des dons à sa portée pour pouvoir surmonter ou mettre en place trois opérations à travers le Royaume et qui totalisent un montant des marchés d'à peu près de 47 millions de dirhams pour la BAD et pour 12 millions de dollars pour l'AFD. En conclusion, et selon l'évaluation, après s'il vous plaît, et selon ce qui a été l'évaluation qui a été faite sur notre expérience d'à peu près de 15 ans dans cette configuration de ce traité, que ce soit avec sans transfert de risque et avec transfert de risque, l'Office, le recours à les opérateurs privés est une décision stratégique pour le Royaume qui vise une rationalisation des charges et en contrepartie une performance technique d'exploitation qui est connue par les opérateurs privés. Donc, on voit que cette expérience a permis d'améliorer les services aux clients dans les zones rurales, de créer de faire associer le secteur privé dans le développement des infrastructures dans les zones rurales et aussi d'améliorer le service dédié pour les clients. Merci pour votre attention.
Merci à vous, monsieur. That was very interesting because it introduced two other important aspects, one of which I touched on in my introduction, that is that scale is not an issue when it comes to PPPs. He referred to tiny ones, 1 person, 3 to 5 people, before he got on to 30 plus. He also introduced the concept of a market approach, which I also personally like. Let's move on to Tunisia. Is our colleague, Mr. Rafiq Aini from Tunisia online? No, okay. Then we'll move on to our last panelist, Engineer Hassan El Far. Can you tell us the story about Gabal El Asfar financing throughout its various phases? In addition, how is CAPW striking a balance between OPEX and CAPEX?
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أنا بتشرف طبعا بوجودي في الاجتماع ده وبشكر الاتحاد الأوروبي وبنك التنمية الأفريقي على هذه الدعوة. أستاذن قبل ما أرد على جواب حضرتك عايز أقول إن الجهاز التنفيذي اللي أنا بتشرف برئاسته ده بينفذ أعمال البنية الأساسية من مشروعات مياه والصرف في 4 محافظات هي القاهرة والإسكندرية والجيزة والقليوبية، يعني القاهرة الكبرى والإسكندرية. المشروعات بتاعتنا بتخدم حوالي 34% من سكان مصر اللي هم ال4 محافظات دول. احنا عندنا مشروع زي مشروع الجبل الاصفر اللي حضرتك بتتكلم عليه، ده مشروع كان مشروع كبير جدا، اتعمل على اكتر من مرحله. المرحله الاولى كانت خلصت سنه 98، ودي دايما الاعمال بتاعتنا اعمال كهروميكانيك واعمال سيفل مدني. النسبه بتبقى تقريبا 50-50، يعني 50% مدني و50% كهروميكانيك غالبا. يعني التمويل في المرحله الاولى كان من الحكومه الايطاليه، كان قرض اللي هي كانت 1,200,000 متر. المرحله الثانيه كانت 500,000، كانت تمويل من جزء من الحكومه الفرنسيه ومن بنك الاستثمار الاوروبي، ده بالنسبه للاعمال الكهروميكانيك. الجزء الثالث اللي هو 19/2 ده كان تمويل قرض من البنك التنميه الافريقي، برضه بيمول 50% من المشروع و50% من الحكومه المصريه. واحنا عندنا مراحل ثانيه، عندنا المرحله اللي جايه ان شاء الله، المرحله الجايه 1,000,000 متر مكعب في اليوم. ال1,000,000 متر مكعب في اليوم دول عباره عن التمويل بتاعهم قرض من بنك التنميه الافريقي ب110 مليون يورو، وبنك والAFD اللي هو الوكاله الفرنسيه للتنميه ب50 مليون يورو. الفكره ليه حضرتك هتقول لي احنا بناخد قروض في الشغل ده، ليه ما بنعملش شراكه؟ لان كلمه شراكه زي ما حضرتك قلت وزي ما الدكتور محمد قال، للاسف ان القطاع الخاص ما بياخدش كلمه شراكه انها شراكه. هو الراجل عايز يكسب زي ما قال المهندس احمد، هو عايز يكسب والبنك عايز يكسب وكله عايز يكسب، لكن ما حدش بيبص للمواطن ولا بيبص للحكومه. فده شيء مهم جدا لازم نعمله. احنا كحكومه ما عندناش مانع اطلاقا من تريبل بي او البي او تي او البي او تي، بالعكس احنا بنرحب جدا بالكلام ده، ولكن لازم نراعي الفرق في التكلفه. احنا عندنا مشكله زي ما قال الدكتور سيد قبل كده، ان الفرق في التكلفه او في التعريفه، ان التعريفه اللي احنا بنطبقها على المواطن غير التعريفه او غير التكلفه الفعليه. يعني كمثال انا هضرب ارقام ولكنها مش دقيقه. انا لما اكلف الحاجه دي 3 جنيه المتر مكعب، 3 جنيه، وابيعه للمواطن بتاعي بجنيه، ويجي المستثمر بتاع الشراكه يقول لي انا عايز 5 جنيه، انا بدل ما بدفع 2 جنيه هدفع 4 جنيه، فده بيبقى عائق. العائق ده يتحل ازاي؟ انا عندي كمثال مقترحات. انا عندي مقترح، اول حاجه يا فندم لازم المستثمر يقلل التكلفه، يبقى عارف ان هو داخل شراكه زي ما حضرتك قلت يا دكتور، داخل شراكه، مش داخل مقاوله ولا داخل ان هو يستثمر وياخد فلوسه بس. انه ما هو بيشيل، بس لازم يشيل معايا ريسك. زي ما انا بدفع للمواطن هو يخليه معايا كويس، يعني بدل ما يكسب انا اسف 10% يكسب 5%، يكسب 3%، يقلل مكسبه. لو قلل مكسبه هيقلل التكلفه. البنك اللي بيديله الفلوس بدل ما ياخد منه 20% يقول له هاخد منك 10% او هاخد منك 5%. يعني البنك نفسه لازم يساعد بغض النظر هو بنك تجاري او بنك غير تجاري حسب قواعد البنك طبعا. المقترح الثالث ان المستثمر يعمل دراسه جدوى وينفذ المشروع ويلم هو الفلوس. ده النظام اللي احنا شفناه في اوروبا، شفناه في المانيا، وشفناه في انجلترا، وشفناه في فرنسا. واحد بيجيب اتوبيسات يمشيها خطوط ويلم الفلوس من الناس، واحد بيعمل محطه ميه وبيلم فلوس من الناس، واحد بيعمل محطه صرف وبيلم فلوس من الناس. هو لو عمل الكلام ده انا كحكومه يبقى دوري مراقب وهرحب جدا بالكلام ده، لان هو لو اي مستثمر حضرتك داخل في الشراكه ساعدني ان هو يقلل التكلفه اللي عليا لكن ما يزودش تكلفه عليا. انا اذا كنت بدفع للمواطن فرق 2 جنيه في المتر، ما ينفعش ان انا ادفعهم 4 واقول دي شراكه، لا، ده انا عايزه يقلل التكلفه بتاعته. لما يقلل التكلفه بتاعته والبنك يقلل الفايده بتاعته وهو ممكن يلم من الناس، الكلام ده هتلاقي الموضوع قريب. الحكومه هتقبل جدا الكلام ده لان الحكومه بترحب بالكلام ده. احنا بنرحب بالكلام ده، ما احنا منفذين الكلام ده وهننفذه قريب في محطات التحليه. محطات التحليه نعملها تريبل بي، وهنعمل حاجات بي او تي، وهنعمل ليه؟ لانه النهارده التكلفه على منطقه معينه، لان التكلفه والشراكه مع القطاع الخاص ما بتنفعش في اي مكان وفي اي حته. انا النهارده لو ناس مستواها الاجتماعي مرتفع مثلا زي اللي في الساحل الشمالي او اللي في القرى السياحيه، وقلت له انك هتدفع في المتر 13 جنيه، هيدفع. فبالتالي اعمل تريبل بي، اعمل بي او تي، اعمل اي حاجه زي ما انت عايز، مفيش مشكله، لان هو التكلفه اللي هيكلفها هياخدها والمواطن هيدفعها، مش هتكلف الدوله حمل زياده. احنا بنقول الشراكه بين القطاع العام والقطاع الخاص، او بين الحكومه والقطاع الخاص، شراكه. انا هتحمل ريسك، ما في ريسك هتحمله، انا ما قلتش ان انا مش هتحمل، لا هتحمل جزء طبعا، ولكن هو لازم يتحمل كمان معايا جزء، ونقلل الموضوع بدل ما يبقى الفرق 50% ولا 100%، خلي الفرق عليا 10% 20%. انا ما شفتش حد من القطاع الخاص درس معايا بحيث ان هو يساعدني كحكومه انه يعمل الكلام ده. احنا بنرحب بالكلام ده جدا طبعا، ولكن لازم يكون الدراسه بتاعته تكون تدي تكلفه قريبه من التكلفه الحقيقيه اللي انا بطلعها. انا بشتغل النهارده زي ما قلت لحضرتك في الجبل الاصفر بقرض، انا باخد قرض 1% او اقل من بنك التنميه الافريقي، وبالتالي الكلام التكلفه بتاعتي بتيجي معقوله وبتيجي قريبه، وحتى الفرق اللي بدفعه ما بين الفرق بين التعريف والتكلفه معقول. ليه؟ لان انا واخد من البنك الافريقي او الاي اي بي او الاو اف دي من اي واحد فيهم 1% او 8 او 9 او 1.1، لكن ما اروحش البنك التجاري اخد منه 20% واقول كمان المستثمر هياخد له 10% في الاخر اتحمل انا الكلام ده كده، ولا اقول دي شراكه. دي مش شراكه. الشراكه ان انا اشيل جزء وهو يشيل جزء. لازم البنك بغض النظر هو بنك تجاري او غير تجاري يقلل الفايده بتاعته، لازم المستثمر يقلل التكلفه بتاعته وما يكسبش مني كتير، لازم هو يساعدني في جزء من التحصيل في حاجات ان امكن يعملها عشان يشيل من عليا الريسك ده. ده رايي بالنسبه لموضوع الشراكه بين القطاع العام والقطاع الخاص، لكن انا بكرر احنا بنرحب بيها جدا طبعا، ونفسنا ان القطاع الخاص يعمل معانا شراكه في كل حاجه، ولكن لازم يكون في المعايير دي تتراعى علشان يبقى في فرق بسيط جدا ان الحكومه تحمله. ده رد على سؤال حضرتك.
Well, thank you so much for that one. Yes, it's a big problem. The private sector, as we learned earlier, has to maximize its returns for its shareholders. That's the law of most countries. The other thing we have to remember is that there is always an opportunity cost on investment capital. If they're not going to make enough money on your deal, they'll go to the deal that does make the money for them. But that does not invalidate your love of PPPs, and indeed mine, because we have this new creature on the block, new kid on the block called blended finance, which is a good way to deal with that. The other problem is the private sector has to make money. That's their law. The private sector service provider mitigates its risk with its interest rates. So the riskier they see your deal, the higher the interest rates will be. But again, this is an opportunity for blended finance, particularly when there's a social good such as access to water concern. So in fact, I value the entire contribution from the panel. And I think we've homed in on, we're running out of time. I did say there were some open questions, so we don't have time for them all, but there is one open question that really grabs quite a few of the issues. During a major participatory study carried out financed by FAO involving experts from Egypt, from Ethiopia and from Sudan, between them they concluded that a reliable enabling environment for private investment was one of two key determinants for water security in the Nile Basin. The other key determinant, by the way, was improved terms of trade between the riparians. This was 18 months of deliberation by local water experts. You don't see anything there about water use efficiency. You don't see anything there about lining canals. It's about trade. It's about enabling environments. So with that in mind, how should the risk be allocated between the public and private partners in a PPP? And what is needed to render the investment environment more enabling in the eyes of the private sector? It's an open question. Who would like to take it? Oh, come on.
انا استاذن انا مش هرد على السؤال، انا عايز ارد على النقطه اللي حضرتك قلتها قبل كده. استاذن احنا بكرر الحكومه ما بتمنعش ان وما بتتمناش ان القطاع الخاص ما يكسبش. ما هو لو زي ما حضرتك بتقول لو ما كسبش مش هيشتغل، يكسب طبعا، ولكن انا بقول كل اللي انا طالبه ان هو يقلل مكسبه وان البنك يقلل فايدته علشان يساعدنا ان احنا نعمل شراكه كبيره، ما تبقاش مجرد في محطات التحليه فقط او في محطات الميه الكبيره فقط، لا تبقى في محطات وشغل كتير جدا. ده مهم جدا. ما حدش بيقول ان هو لو ما لقاش الفلوس عندي هيروح، طبعا هيروح لحد تاني يكسب منه، ولكن انا عايزه يكسب، ولكن عشان يكسب قليل. هي دي الشراكه اللي بتكلم عليها، والا نشيل كلمه شراكه ونغيرها بحاجه ثانيه. شكرا.
Yeah, that's a very difficult issue because a private company compelled to reduce its profit margins will delay its repair and maintenance to the last minute. But thank you. Does anybody want to come back to the earlier question about the enabling environment or risk allocation? If not, I've got another one.
Actually, the question has two parts. Part is related to the public sector. Maybe Mr. Ater can cover that, and the other part is related to the private sector. So you mentioned 2 points, and what Dr. Hassan mentioned as well about the meaning of the partnership, and the other point about the risk allocation. So the meaning of the partnership, that each party is committed to his obligations to provide the service to the other party, and from the other side, from the public sector, is he has his own obligation as an off-taker for the service. So the real partnership is that each party is committed to the other party. This is the partnership. But the partnership doesn't mean that we lose money. This is not a successful partnership. So this is one thing. The other thing about the risk allocation is the same point. So it's also related to the partnership. It's our portion. I will talk about the risk allocation for the private sector, and maybe Mr. Atif will cover other points as well. So the risk that we can mitigate or can consider as a private sector is we have our own risks: risk of finance, risk of inflation, risk of sustainability, risk of availability of the plant. So, for example, if this project is not producing the required quantity or quality, or not available 100% of the time, or whatever availability is agreed, this is our commitment, and we take this risk, and we may lose money to be able to commit. And a lot of the PPP agreements, especially the PPP agreements, are unlike the EPC agreements. They have very high liquidated damages and penalties on the concessionaire. So normally, performance guarantees for EPC projects are 5%, 10%. For PPPs, it can go up to 20%. The delay penalties can go up to 10%. So we are subject to very high penalties and liquidated damages that can reach 30% of the project. And on the other side, we are subject to interest rates to the lenders. So we do not say the profit. We do not request the profit. The banks, they ask us for the profit. It's not a choice for us. If we submit a financial model with the tender to the off-taker, to the government, and they can see everything, how the financial model is structured based on what the banks will accept. So we cannot get grants or long-term loans from financial institutions. We are a private sector. We collaborate with commercial banks, so we have to abide with the rules of the commercial banks. Of course, there are other sources of finance with low interest rates, like, for example, JICA or other AFDB. Or if we have access to this, of course, we won't mind to get cheap financing to the government. Whenever we can do this, we will do it, to get cheap financing to the project. We want to help the government, and we are not very greedy, or we are not willing only to make money. We want to help the governments.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you would allow me for the...
Mohammed, are you waiting to contribute? Who's Engineer Attar,
yeah.
and then Mohammed.
Regarding the risk allocation. The risk allocation, or the risk reallocation as we call it, is the secret of the PP. It's the secret of successful PP. Is the structure of the project, which draws a clear line between the responsibilities and rights of the private sector and the responsibilities and the rights of the public sector. So the name of the game of a successful PP is the risk allocation. And there's something important here to say, that it will never go cut and paste or copy and paste. What's successful in the UK will not be successful in Egypt, will not be successful in Tunisia, might not be successful in Uganda or any other world. The risks are very much country specific. The risks, if we want to classify it, to classify the risk, we've got the country risk, we've got the sector risk, and we've got the project risk. And it should be studied for each and every project. You cannot say that these are the risks of the wastewater treatment plants, so we'll take it as is and distribute it or allocate it in this way. No. Even the financial risks in the same country for the same project might vary from one time to another. 2013, 2014, before the flotation of the Egyptian pound, the financial issues was treated away, and after November 2016, it's completely different. The economical environment changes, and accordingly the risks changes, and accordingly the manipulating these risks and allocating these risks differs from one time to another, from one country to another, from one sector to another, and from one project to another in the same sector. I want to give you an example, for instance, for the risk allocation. Normally in Europe, they ask the private sector to price his service and include the inflation risk in their pricing. It's normally the inflation risk in most of the European countries, like Germany or England or France. The inflation envelope is very limited. They go up 1%, 2.5%, and go down for 0.5% or 1%. They don't have the inflation, annual inflation is working with a given or a known envelope, apart from any spikes or any economical crisis that might happen from time to time. But this is the normal. It's easy to predict, it's easy to factor it in their prices. In Egypt, if you take the inflation in the last 10, 15 years, you'll find that the inflation shoots up to 28, 29%, and goes down to 17%, 11%, 8%, then up again. So the variation is very high. If you ask the private sector, and this is the normal system in most of the European countries using the PPs, if you ask the private sector to factor this in his price, he will take the higher average of the inflation and factor it in his price. This means that the government will be paying higher premium for the risks throughout the contract. Maybe in a few years later, the inflation as we have it now, the inflation goes down to 9% or 10% or 8%, and you will be still paying the average of 20 or 19%, because this is the average of the last period. And the project and the private sector has to take this kind of contingency. So in this case, in Egypt, we said, no, we will not follow the international norm. We will reallocate the risk of inflation to the government. And the pricing system and the documents were readjusted for that. There is a lot of examples, but this is just an example for the allocation risk.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your elaborate answer. I think the whole question of risk allocation is one of the more interesting facets of this discussion. I could give you an example of an Israeli company that went to the government of Botswana, said, we've got a great business idea. It's going to cost $600 million. You pay the $600 million. You take the risk. We'll take the profits, and your benefit as a country is the tax revenue. That was a real proposal. Dr. Mohammed, please.
No, I will. I won't take time because I may be repeating what Mr. Tura said, because I mean the government now is through the mechanisms of escalation formulas and all of that can allocate, can take the risk of the inflation, and then this is part of the sharing of the risk has been taken by the government. Especially in Egypt, the escalation I mean, values and trends are different than Europe, because in Europe it's quite minimal. As well as some risks related to the foreign currency fluctuation, which is important. I mean, of course, the private sector can take this and make hedging, but this again is another is creating the cost. And with regard to the banks that would finance this, maybe we can approach. I mean, it's the job of the private sector or the bidders to try to get very good rates for the financing, maybe through the involvement of ECAs or whatever mechanisms. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, plenum, we're already out of time. Will you give me 5 more minutes to ask the panelists what their takeaway is? Can I have 5 minutes more? Thank you so much. Right, panelists, one by one. What is the biggest investment challenge in your in-tray? And if you had a free hand, how would you fix it?
The first thing for the PPPs to run, I've got no problem with the private sector. I've got no problems with the banks once the structure of the project is bankable. The main problem is with the government. The government have preparation and the acceptance and understanding on the philosophy and the concept of the PPPs or the public-private partnership. It's not the main problem that we face in different countries, because I've worked on the PPPs in different countries in my capacity working with the World Bank before. The main problem is that when you compare the cost of a PPP project, the project done under the PPP, and you compare it under an EPC, you're not comparing apple to apple. You're not comparing real comparable figures. This is an EPC, and you add some cost of operation. Maybe you can add some cost of maintenance, but it's not the case. Where's the cost of financing of the government? The government cost of financing, especially in countries like Egypt, the cost of financing is high. We are happy with a 1 or 2% interest rate from the African Development Bank or from the World Bank, but where's the currency risk? You didn't calculate the currency risk that you're paying over 20 years or 30 years of currency risk. All these kinds of risks should be calculated, and the government has to understand and accept the evaluation of the risk. The PPP, number one, to say that this project is a PPP project, the number one, you have to check the parameter of the value for money. Value for money means that the overall project cost, as we call it, the total cost of ownership. Total cost of ownership is not the capex. It's not the capex and the opex. It's the entire project over the span of the years of the project. Total cost of ownership compared between the government and the private sector. If the private sector is less because you have got better mitigation of risks, then this is a PP project. If the government, given the power and the facilities that the government have, the overall cost of the project, the government is less, then this is not a PP project.
That's a lot more than a minute, with all due respects. Thank you so much. Moving on, a gentleman from Matitu, Ahmed Farouk, how would you answer those questions? A little bit more briefly, if you don't mind.
The main challenge, as Mr. Atter said, is the political will of the government to execute the Triple P project, or to follow the Triple P scheme or the Triple P approach. This is the main challenge that we face everywhere, not only in Egypt, but it's all over the world the same case. This is the main challenge.
And you would fix it how?
I'm not a government
executive.
I'm not a government official.
Who's next? Mohammed, it's you. Yep. You're next. Okay. Your biggest problem and how would you fix it?
What I'm seeing, what I think here is that we are trying to play a game of all or nothing. So why don't we go midway? So the government argument is that okay, you are going to take so much profit and this is going to be hard for us. And the private sector says that this is my cost. Maybe the private sector should be engaged with governmental entities like companies And then the government might be happy because part of the profit would go to them, and the private sector is happy as well. So we need to get both ways, because it's a bit, you know, this, you are taking all the profit and the profit is high, so this might duplicate the matter.
If I may add to this, it happens. This example is happening in, for example, in Algeria, when they form an SPV, a special purpose vehicle for a project. The government owns 50% of the SPV, so the government is also making profit out of the project, or is part of the project as well. So we can follow this this example. It's already applied.
Actually, that's interesting. The first job I did after leaving graduate school, I spent 4 years working on the Kanana sugar project in Sudan, where the government is an equity shareholder along with the private sector.
Yeah.
The whole thing commercially financed, even the government share. It is still working, it is still making a profit for the shareholders. To me, that's a PPP on the production side. Is our colleague in Morocco still? Yes. Sir, Mr. Mubarak.
Monsieur le Président, permettez-moi de dire que l'eau, ce n'est pas une affaire de secteur privé uniquement, mais c'est une affaire qui doit être portée dans les prochaines années par le public et le secteur privé. Surtout qu'on est devant une situation de rareté des ressources en eau à travers le royaume, et par conséquent, une mobilisation de cette ressource sera de plus en plus difficile et de plus en plus coûteuse, ce qui va impacter énormément le coût de revient de mètres cubes à mobiliser pour desservir la population. Et par conséquent, bien que des solutions actuelles et des formules actuelles ont pu surmonter les problèmes, mais il faut que les deux parties, publiques et privées, se mettent en table pour innover, bien sûr avec l'assistance des bailleurs de fonds, pour innover d'autres formules pour faire face à ces risques futurs. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Merci bien, monsieur. Et enfin, Engineer Ehsan El-Far.
استاذ حضرتك، الخلاصه زي ما حضرتك بتقول ان احنا نقعد مع بعض ونشوف التحديات زي ما قال المهندس عاطر، لان هي المشكله هي التحديات والمخاطر. المخاطر والتحديات هي لو قدرنا نقرب المواضيع مع بعضها هنلتقي. لان زي ما بقول لحضرتك انا عندي مخاطر وعندي الكلام ده. انا ما قلتش ان انا هطبق النظام اللي بيتعمل في لندن عندي، او ما قلت ان انا هطبق النظام اللي بيتعمل في اوروبا عندي، لا انا عارف. انا بقول ان انا شفت الكلام ده في اوروبا. انا في مصر ظروفي مختلفه، وزي ما قال المهندس عاطر كل مشروع ظروفه مختلفه. في فرق بين مشروع التحليه ومشروع الصرف الصحي ومشروع الميه، ونفس المشروع مختلف من مكان لاخر. ممكن يختلف، ينفع التريبل بي هنا او ينفع الدي او تي هنا وهنا ما ينفعش. كل مشروع حسب ظروفه لازم يدرس. لازم اي مشروع يدرس وتشاف المخاطر بتاعته، ونحاول نقلل المخاطر عشان نلتقي. وده املنا كحكومه، لان الحكومه عندها اراده سياسيه فعلا، مش زي ما بيقول المهندس احمد، لا عندها اراده سياسيه وعامله قانون الشراكه، والمهندس عاطر يتكلم عن الكلام ده. لا عندها اراده سياسيه تماما، واحنا موافقين جدا على الكلام ده، ولكن احنا عايزين نلتقي ونقلل المخاطر علشان نقدر نقعد مع بعض ونستفيد بالمشروعات ان شاء الله.
Well, thank you so much. That is an excellent way to close this, what I found to be an interesting session, finding common ground. Common ground for investment, common ground for sharing risk, common ground for planning, common ground for decision making. I think that is a very useful message to take away. But all of us in this room know that it is a big challenge. And with that encouraging thought, thank you for your attention. I guess it's lunchtime. Enjoy your lunches. And once again, thanks to our panel for an illuminating session. Thanks.